So I do want to just say a few words about our next speaker, Professor Valerie Purdie-Vaughns, because she's not necessarily one of the usual suspects in a forum like this, and I think of that as being all to the greater good. I became familiar with Professor Purdie-Vaughns' work before I met her as a person and found out that she was, in fact, the parent of a classmate of my daughter's in preschool. So it was sort of, I was a little starstruck, this iconic figure before me at preschool drop-off. Professor Purdie-Vaughns, or Valerie as I like to call her, is a social psychologist by training. She's a student of Claude Steele's, and she'll tell you a little bit about stereotype threat and the field that she has been one of the pioneers of. But she is almost unique among social psychologists in really emphasizing taking theory and research from the psychology lab and applying it in a productive way in the field. And a lot of her focus has been, in fact, on education. So I'd like to turn it over to her now to tell us what she's found and what she's working on in this area.
Thank you. It actually gets worse. I'm quite horrified to find out that the director of our 5-year-old's preschool is in the audience. And I can't figure out how to get my 5-year-old to act right, but I can tell you about the science of social psychology and education. So there you go. So the title of my talk is Using Social Psychology to Lift Achievement and Reduce Inequality in the Classroom. And to begin, so first of all, just a confession that I am an experimental social psychologist, and so my training is not necessarily in education, but what I look at is how features of the social environment around us, anywhere from how close or far we sit together to features of classrooms and schools, can affect people's psychology. So that's where I'm coming from. And in particular, I think about the idea of broadening participation, of making sure that all students, regardless of their race or gender or disability, their sexual orientation, where they're from, have the opportunity to learn. Now, when most people typically think about this issue of broadening participation, they typically think of two things. One is smart people in key places, put the experts where they should be, and make sure maybe we have diversity consultants, put the onus on them, and they will solve all of our school's problems. The second is thinking about more effective tools and metrics for assessing change, diversity scorecards, and ways of sort of evaluating progress. And there's a lot to say about the value of these approaches, but what I would argue as a psychologist is that something here is missing. And what I focus on is two things. It's a very sort of broad psychological phenomenon that we apply to schools. The idea being that for people who are members of diverse groups, by this I mean any number of diverse groups, gender, race, sexual orientation, political affiliation, income, that there is a hidden and overt bias, and this bias can cause an added stress. And this is stress that is not faced by others. And this stress can undermine performance, meaning academic performance in schools, motivation, and also health. And I'll be focusing today on performance and motivation, but I also do work in the area of health disparities. And so as a function of this, broadening participation requires an attentiveness and altering the psychological climate to reduce this stress. So there's an added mix in our work where we have to think more about the psychological climate of members of diverse groups. And so on my nice PowerPoint, this is actually different shades of red, but it's looking more like different shades of gray. But I like to start off with where our research started, which was thinking about racial achievement, or I like to call them opportunity gaps in education. It is, from a national perspective, a very important problem, the economic and health costs of the achievement gap. I'm sure this is an audience that knows far more about this than you probably want to. But for a psychologist, it's an interesting puzzle. It's an interesting puzzle because at just about every level of education, there is an achievement gap. In just about every nation where there is a minority and majority group, there is an achievement gap. And here you can see these are a National Assessment of Educational Progress scores by state, darker states, meaning that there is a larger achievement gap of about almost 31 percentage points on a scale from 0 to 500. But pretty much any place that data can be collected, there is some form of an achievement gap. And so this becomes a very interesting question of why this would be. Also, as a psychologist, an equally interesting question is that of underperformance. So the problem with achievement gaps is that you can also think of multiple causes for it, that people come from different economic statuses or different neighborhoods, and these kinds of factors might contribute to this difference in the achievement gap. But underperformance is quite different, because with underperformance, what happens is you take two students, say, for example, a college student, a female and a male going into, say, physics or engineering. They both have about a 1200 SAT. A 1200 SAT at a place like Columbia should predict at the end of 4 years an A. And so what happens is, for the underrepresented group, for example, women in science, that same 1200 SAT score at time one, meaning your freshman year, will only predict a B or maybe a B minus. Where for the dominant group, in this context being men, it would predict an A. So to the extent that you have two groups that differ only by gender, they have the same score when they first enter college, something about the environment over time is making it such that the underrepresented group is not getting as much out of their education. So that, as a psychologist, gets us thinking about the social environment in which education is happening. And so for the past 5 or 6 years, we have been trying to think about what is it about social environments and thinking about the stereotypes that are around us in society and how it can actually affect academic and cognitive performance. And so our team is called Project Achieve. It doesn't actually stand for anything. We just thought that was really cool. And it's a field-based research interventions that are designed by social psychologists to reduce racial and gender opportunity gaps in academic performance. We work in our laboratories, and then we partner with educators to apply social psychology theories of identity to education. What's unique about our work is that it's all longitudinal experimental work where we create double-blind random assignments in schools where the teachers don't know who in their classroom is who is in the experiment. The students themselves don't actually know that they're in an experiment because we get the parents' permission years before. We've been generously supported by the National Science Foundation. And so what I'd like to do is sort of start off first talking about this first piece of what this added stress is, and then I'll talk about the interventions that we've been doing, and hopefully this will generate discussions about what next steps can be in terms of our conversation today. So I'd like to start off with a very sort of textbook definition of stereotype threat, which is this added stress that's not faced by other groups, and then I'll give you an example of how it's studied. So stereotype threat is defined as the threat of being viewed through the lens of a negative stereotype or the fear of doing something that would inadvertently confirm that stereotype. And my advisor, Claude Steele, came up with this term, and he argued that members of diverse groups can be wary of situations in which their behavior can confirm that their group lacks some kind of valuability. So this is a very general phenomenon. And this extra pressure caused by this concern of reinforcing stereotypes can interfere with performance. And so I want to give you a couple of examples of when I travel around the country. Oftentimes I'll just ask students, like, does this resonate with you? What might that experience look like? And so this is one student from a school, this was from Vassar College, and she said, this is something I deal with constantly, especially considering my education taking place in the North, is how I came from North Carolina, which is in the South. Like I should be a redneck or have a Southern drawl and drop out of college. The southern town I live in is Chapel Hill, one of the most liberal college towns in the USA. So here, the stereotype being that of accents, one of the most powerful stereotypes that we have in this country, making her feel this added stress. oftentimes, stereotype threat is very difficult to articulate, and I'll talk about why this is, but it comes in the form of people saying that they're just really not good at test taking. And so this is Rodney Ellis, former state senator of Texas, saying, "I knew I was just as intelligent as everyone else. For some reason, I didn't score well on tests. Maybe I was just nervous. There's a lot of pressure on you, knowing that if you fail your race." And implicit in this idea is that the stereotype about African Americans not being particularly smart is one that he's bumping up against when he is taking tests. So some of the original work on this was experimental. It was done in the laboratory. Laboratories, oftentimes educators become very frustrated, but what's nice about the laboratory is you can isolate what you think is going on to try to understand the process. And so in the early studies, these were done at University of Michigan. First set of studies looking at women in math. They had female and male college students come into a laboratory one at a time. They sat at a table very similar to this. It was probably square instead of round. But they're sitting at a table one at a time. They don't know that it's a study about gender or identity. They are asked to take very difficult sections of the math GRE, which is what you need to take to get into graduate school. What's important about what I just said is that these tests are very difficult. So I can talk about this later. When the tests are easy, you don't get stereotype threat effects. And then what happens is the experimenter just manipulates something about the test instructions that we argue can turn on or off the stereotype. So in what we call the control condition, participants are just told, and again, they're just sitting there one at a time, and they're about to take this test, and they say, you know, this is a GRE, just do the best you can. You have 30 minutes to answer the question. So the same kind of test instructions that we've all taken for any kind of graduate record exam. In the treatment condition, the no gender difference condition, both men and women are told, well, we know there may be gender differences out there, but on this particular test, we have found that there are no gender differences. Then please, you know, do as well as you can, and you'll have 30 minutes and so on. So the idea is to try to turn off the stereotype in that particular moment, and then they measure test performance on the graduate record exam in the laboratory. And so on the y-axis here, you have test scores with higher bars meaning better performance. You have the control group. Your no gender difference, our experimental group. The blue bars are the men, and the red bars are the women. And what you find is that in the control condition, the conditions under which all of our students are taking tests on a daily basis, what you find is that the men are outperforming women almost 3 to 1. And when you sort of map this onto that spatial racial achievement gap, the percentage of the gap that we find in the laboratory looks strikingly similar to the gap that you see in the real world data. When you tell women and men in that particular moment that there are no gender differences on this particular test, the logic is psychologically what's happening is that it's reducing the heat of the stereotype in that moment. And two things happen, which I'll just sort of point out right now. If you look at the red bars, women's performance is lifted significantly. And the other sort of interesting thing that happens is that the male's test performance drops slightly. So on any one given experiment, that's not significant, but when you conduct a meta-analysis across about 80 studies, it does wind up being a significant effect. And so stereotype threat suggests that there's something about being on the downside of your own group's negative stereotype, and there's something, a little bit of a boost you get about being on the upside of somebody else's negative stereotype. So very quickly, this was replicated again, the target group of underrepresentation being African Americans in sort of broader intellectual settings. This was a study that was done on verbal ability, where African American and white undergraduates came into the lab, again, one at a time. They didn't know this was a test about identity or anything of that nature. They were asked to take a difficult section of the GRE. In one condition, they're told this test is an accurate measure of verbal ability, meaning that how you do on this test reflects something about how smart you are. In the treatment or the no stereotype threat condition, They are told that, you're just helping us out today. This test is an instrument for solving problems. And then again, we look at performance. And what you find is, again, you get this very same pattern of effect. At this point, there's been over 3,500 studies that have been done worldwide, and you get the same effect, that in the diagnostic condition, the condition where they are told that your test performance says something about you, you get this achievement gap between white and African American students. In the non-diagnostic condition, when you're told this test is just an instrument for solving problems, the achievement gap is eliminated. There have been many different iterations of this work. There's been work done by Talia Benzeev and colleagues showing that when you look at female college students taking a very difficult math test in the presence of male test takers, as you titrate the room with more and more male test takers, their performance on math goes down in a stair-step fashion. So in comparison to female college students, their test performance with 2 male test takers compared to female college student test performance with two female versus male test takers. There has been studies looking at the comparison group here. I believe this was done in Silicon Valley, looking at white male students in comparison to Asian American male students. In math, you get the same stereotype threat effects. Again, the issue being that the context of when the stereotype becomes a sort of alive in one's initial life is what is relevant. It's the identity in context that matters. This has become of recent interest to me because I just turned 41. So when you look at the research on age, the older-younger split is whether you're older or younger than 40 years old. This was a study that was done on memory and performance, taking adults that were older than 40 or younger than 40 and having them do a memory task. And when they're just told that it's a very straightforward memory task, you find that younger participants in the black are outperforming older participants. When they're told that there are no age differences, all of a sudden you get this, again, reduction in this age gap. So whenever I can't look at my mom and my mom can't find her keys, I'm like, that's stereotype threat. Don't worry about it. Just go pick up my child. One of the criticisms of this early work is that it's been really focused in the laboratory and it's been focused on college students. Since this earlier work, it's really proliferated in many really exciting ways. There's a study of over 15,000 college students looking at academic performance, looking at self-reports of stereotype threat at freshman year, and then predicting grades for the minority students. These are African American, Latino, and Native American students in senior year, and finding that these self-reports of stereotype threat predict about 35% of the variance in academic performance and grades. There's been studies that have been done on leadership, some really interesting work taking female faculty and male faculty in science and technology, having them walk around with audio recorders all day and just sort of organically talking to their colleagues. And what they find is that these self-reports of stereotype threat at the beginning of the year predict whether female science professors organically start to talk about their research in the presence of male faculty. There's also some work coming out of my laboratory looking at cortisol, which is a hormone that we know is linked at least somewhat to obesity. And we've found that self-reports of stereotype threat at the beginning of freshman year are predicting about a 10-pound increase in weight for underrepresented groups by their junior year. We've also recently just replicated this with middle school students. I'd just like to point out before I move to the interventions, it's very easy to think of stereotype threat as sort of rooted in the individual. And it's really rooted in the historic and contemporary threat that's systemic in school structures or any kind of structure. So it's really not about what the student is carrying around inside of them, but what is it about the environment? And we find that particularly hopeful because that's how you can target change. So, for example, you could be in an environment, I know, poor Larry, right? You could be in an environment where certain groups have been historically excluded, and even though there may not be any current understanding of that, there's always this historical residue that can affect the climate. Poor Larry. I love to talk about Larry Summers because when you actually look at the entire transcript of what he was talking about when this comment came up about him commenting about innate differences between men and women, he was really trying to struggle with a very difficult question that he was being asked. And I would almost argue this was a faux pas. Nevertheless, he wound up saying that there's innate differences between men and women, might be one reason fewer women succeed in science and math careers. A very interesting study tracked women in economics at Harvard across the semester where this whole brouhaha was going, and showed that for women and not men in economics, that their scores dropped about 1.5 standard deviations during this time period. So again, this is sort of that it's rooted in the context along with the identity. Very quickly, there's a study that was done that tries to get at that. This was a study done with women in science. It's a little bit difficult to see, but the idea was, can you manipulate the cues around the room that signal whether your identity is going to be at issue or not? And for women in STEM, this study actually manipulated what they call geek cues. That's what the name of the paper says. I can't make this stuff up, right? So on the wall, there's a Star Trek poster. Here in the corner, there are Coke cans. I gave a talk similar to this in California, and they said, no, it's Mountain Dew, but whatever. It was Coke here in New York, and there are science fiction books. The participants were told nothing about these cues. They just came in, they sat at this desk, and they took a math test. In the non-stereotypical room, there was a nature poster, neutral books, and water bottles. And then you just take men and women and you just look at their interest in computer science. So on the y-axis is an index of interest and motivation in computer science. Higher numbers mean greater interest. And what you can see with the blue bars is that there's no significant difference in the climate. The culture of the room has no effect on men's interest in computer science. But for women, it has a very large effect, such that in the stereotypical room, with the bars on the left, women had less interest in science, but in the non-stereotypical room on the right, they actually had a greater interest in science. And so we would argue that, again, the culture or the environment that one finds themselves can have a powerful effect on motivation. So I just want to argue that at this point, what we know as psychologists is that stereotype threat is a multi-level phenomenon. In many respects, the classroom is just one instantiation of how it works. And so at the neurological level, stereotype threat has been implicated in low recruitment of areas of the brain that's associated with learning, and over-recruitment of areas associated with the brain that's related to self-regulation of emotions. So basically what that means is that the parts of your brain involved in learning are shut down, and the parts of your brain that are involved in trying to regulate your emotions and sort of keep your stress level down are up. Exactly the opposite of what you want to happen when you're taking a difficult test. Oh, sorry. At the physiological level, what you find is the increase in arousal, higher cardiovascular reactivity, and heightened immune system response. So all of that means is that it's like your heart is beating a little bit faster, almost like you're walking on a treadmill when you're taking a test, and your immune system is activated, so you're just more likely to get sick over time. At the cognitive level, what you find is impaired executive functioning and working memory, the kind of memory you need to, say, give a talk. And then at the sort of global contextual level, what you find is that there's a real plummet in trust and one's sense of belonging, and a heightened perception that the environment is a threatening place. So at the neurological, physiological, cognitive, and contextual level, stereotype threat is operating. It's an added stress that one group is experiencing that the other group is not. So the take-home message for this first part is that stereotype threat affects any group that is seen through the lens of a negative stereotype in a particular context. Stereotype threat is a multi-level phenomenon that implicates psychological and biological systems in the human body. And stereotype threat stems from historic and contemporary structural factors that perpetuate stereotypes. And I can talk in the Q&A about some of the different environments, gendered, all-girls schools, those sorts of things if you have questions about that. So what to do about this? So what we have been thinking about in terms of the science of broadening participation, specifically to target this stereotype threat, is that we've been testing interventions that the logic of them in a variety of different ways is to reduce stereotype threat. I'm only going to have time, I'll definitely get to the one on mentoring and maybe the one on affirmation. I just want to point out that we have done some really cool studies around the election of Obama in 2008, showing that when you look at that time span and we do these random assignments to think about Obama, it can also affect student achievement. I'm not going to have time to talk about that today, but you can ask me in the Q&A. So the first one I want to talk about are called wise feedback interventions. And the question that we ask ourselves is, how can you be critical of a student's behavior without undermining the motivation and self-confidence needed to improve? And this is really thinking about minority students. And sort of my proposal or our argument is that in an environment where there is stereotype threat, it's sort of in almost pretty much any school environment, providing unambiguous, clear feedback of high expectations and assurance that students can reach those expectations is one formula for reducing a stereotype threat. And this reassures students, particularly underrepresented students, that their identity will not be a barrier to success, that their identity will not be at issue. So I think that most of the time, many of us think about, so is the environment prejudiced or it's not prejudiced, is it biased or it's not biased? But what we argue is that all an environment has to be is ambiguous with respect to one's identity, and that is the engine that starts to get stereotype threat going. So we call these interventions wise. It's sort of a sociological term that conveys to stereotyped individuals that they're seen in terms of their full humanity and that they're not going to be reduced through the lens of a negative stereotype. And so how is this done? So in these original WISE interventions, I'll show you one laboratory experiment, and then I'll show you how we translated this into a middle school to look at performance. In the original study, African American and white college students came into the laboratory. They were asked to work on a very difficult essay. So they work on an essay. They are given all kinds of critical feedback, the kind of feedback you would give any student on their essay. But then they are randomly assigned a particular kind of feedback and then asked whether they want to continue working on their essay. So in one condition, they're given what's called unbuffered criticism. This is the kind of criticism none of us like, where they just say, this essay is pretty terrible, and then they sort of go on. These are the sort of the different problems. You need these periods and commas and sort of grammatical style substance issues. So this is just criticism. In what we call the unwise condition, it's called the same identical criticism is given. And again, these are minority and white students. They're in the laboratory one at a time. They don't know this is a study about identity. And they're told that we're going to give you criticism, but first, overall, nice job. Your enthusiasm for your teacher really shows through. You have some interesting ideas in your letter and you make some good points. I provided, and it goes on, it says several areas that can be improved, and then you get this criticism. We use this condition because this is typically what teachers do, particularly to minority students. This was not a nice job, it's a terrible essay. So it's sort of these nice sort of platitudes that oftentimes make us feel better as educators. But what we argue continues to create this ambiguity because you know you didn't really do a good job. And then what we call the wise criticism, which is a formula of the same kind of criticism, but we also layer it with what is called high standards and assurance that you can meet the standard. So in this condition, it says, judged by a high standard, the one that really counts, that is whether your letter will be publishable in our journal, I have serious reservations. So already the standard is set for what the teacher thinks the student can do.
The comments I provide in the following pages are quite critical, but I hope helpful. Remember, I wouldn't go to the trouble of giving you this feedback if I didn't think, based on what I've read in your letter, that you're capable of meeting the higher standard that I mentioned. So this is our wise criticism condition. And then what do we find? So then now on the y-axis, you're looking at task motivation, which is the number of hours students spend revising their essay. The gray bars are the white students, and what you can see is that regardless of whether they're given unbuffered criticism and these nice platitudes, or criticisms on the high standards in insurance, the amount of time they spend is about 4 hours revising their essay, which is still, that's pretty good. But what you also find is that for the minority students, these slight subtle shifts in the kind of criticism that is given has a powerful effect on the task motivation, such that the unbuffered criticism, they spend significantly less time working on their essay, and in the criticism plus high standards and assurance, they spend significantly more time. And so you can see that what we're arguing, we also have other measures, which I'm not going to include in this talk, showing that the mediating mechanism, what is going on here, is that their trust in the feedback increases, and their concern about being stereotyped decreases. So that's the mechanism that is in place. So we then took this idea into middle school to see if we could actually see if we can affect middle school performance. This is a paper that is just about to come out. It's under review in child development. It's just about to come out in a couple of weeks. And so we used 7th graders in middle school. There are, as you all know, many sort of important developmental forks in the road, and 7th grade is one of them. So many of our interventions focus on 7th graders and also 9th graders and also freshmen in college. This was a school that was economically middle class, so about approximately 23% received free lunch. It was located in the northeastern U.S., so it was actually in Connecticut. The student body was approximately 50% African American and 50% white. So just by random assignment in any given classroom, you've got your nice treatment and control. So what we did is that we actually worked with the teachers, and we had the African American and white 7th grade students. They wrote an essay about their hero. It was a 6-week lesson. And the teachers, they just so happened to be white. We couldn't experimentally manipulate that. So they grade and give feedback. So they have a control condition where they're giving feedback, and then we try to use this high standards and assurance condition. But what we did, because we didn't want the teachers to be aware of the kind of feedback that was given, what we did was 2 things. The teachers graded the essays, and then they gave them to us. We then pinned the control or wise intervention feedback onto the essay, put them in envelopes, gave it back to the teachers, and then the teachers gave the feedback to the students. So in real life, this doesn't make any sense at all. From an experimental perspective, it helps keep the teacher blind to the kind of feedback in terms of this control or wise feedback condition. So it looks like this. The teacher will grade the actual essays, and then we pin the note there. And in the WISE feedback group, it just says, I'm giving you these comments because I have high standards and I know that you can meet them. And that's it. This is the actual note. In the control group, it says, I'm giving you these comments so you have feedback on your essay. So it's just tautological. And here what you find on the y-axis is the percent of students, these are 7th grade students, that are revising their essays. And what you find is that in the control condition, 62% of white students and 17% of African American students choose to revise their essay about their hero. In the treatment condition, where we merely pin these notes about high standards and assurance onto their essays, you now completely reduce the achievement gap in the percent of students that are revising their essay. And as we all know, the amount of time you spend revising your work should predict your grades. I'll show you a second study where we actually look at grades. So in our second study, what we did is that statistically we had to come up with a metric that we would be able to use in order to statistically control for the different modeling of the class and the wave of students that are in our different cohorts. So they don't actually look like grades. We came up with a 14-point scale. But again, what you find is, again, it was the same seventh grade, second cohort, the control versus the WISE intervention condition. And now this is a metric that translates into the difference between about an A is at the very 14 and about a C minus is around an 8. And what you find is that, again, we're able to completely eliminate the achievement gap, not only in terms of the percent of students revising their essays, but their actual final grade. So both groups wind up getting approximately about a B+. So the take-home message for these WISE interventions is that there are many minority students. They are they may be aware of bias or stereotypes or discrimination, or they just might have this sense that their identity is at issue. One of the things that I have found quite startling is that not only can you get these effects in 7th grade, but you can get them as early as 3rd grade, all the way up to high school, college, and graduate school. We're actually replicating this in the law school right now. And so these past adversities have effects in part because they leave a psychological residue. And raising classroom rigor may not close achievement gaps if they don't address this identity-based ambiguity. WISE strategies can disabuse students of this ambiguity and unlock motivation. I just want to be sensitive to the time. So we have 20 minutes. I could talk about one more set of interventions, or I could stop and take questions. I don't know. Does anyone have some more time? Okay. Okay, so I'll end by talking about another class of interventions that we've been working on called value affirmation interventions. I've been doing this work with my colleague, Jeffrey Cohen, who's at the Stanford School of Education. And I'd like to pose the question, knowing that psychological climates can impair performance, how can we reduce threat so students can achieve in the face of those climates? And our sort of hypothesis or our proposal is figuring out a way to reduce threat by shoring up what we call students' core sense of self, their values and who they think they are in the world. And I like to sort of make it this note that this is not self-esteem. It's not about making students feel good. It's about tapping into the things that they value in their own lives during moments of stress. So at this moment, I'd like to turn from the very sort of serious issue of achievement gaps to talking about grape soda. This is a campaign that, for those of you who live in New York City, you should be familiar with this. This was a campaign about reducing obesity. So this is an African-American male. His leg is amputated there, and the idea is that the more soda you drink, that this is going to happen to you. Now, there are many, many things wrong with this advertisement that have nothing to do with threat. This was photoshopped and on and on. But I have a point here. Now, if you, and my point here is about what I call our psychological immune system. So say you are a person who does not consume sugary drinks. You look at this advertisement and you go, this doesn't apply to me. I don't consume sugary drinks. This ad doesn't apply to me at all, and you just ignore it. The argument that communication folks make is that for people who do drink sugary drinks, they'll look at that, they go, uh-oh, I drink sugary drinks, I shouldn't do this, I don't want to be like this, and I'm going to stop drinking. That never happens. That absolutely doesn't happen, because we have a very powerful psychological immune system that protects us against threatening information, so it closes us to feedback. So we say something like this. We go, well, I don't drink as many sugary stuff as the person sitting next to me. And anyway, I walk to my car every day, which is exercise, and the researchers who study diabetes are paid by medical companies. Who can trust them? Whew, this ad does not apply to me. And actually, each of these are psychological principles, motivated skepticism, all these different things. The point being that we have a psychological immune system that when it's put in place, if you're under threat, you're not going to be open to receiving the information. And what I'd like to argue, I'm just going to skip this for the moment. What I'd like to argue is that for minority students, for women in STEM, for students that are from different socioeconomic classes, school can be like that advertisement. And that school can be a threatening environment, and that we can protect the self with strategies that undermine performance. So we don't seek feedback with our teachers, we don't spend more time revising our work, we might sort of psychologically disengage, and these are ways to protect the self in the face of a threatening school environment, even when we're trying our best to make it an environment where all students can learn. And so our argument is to provide students at the individual level this psychological armor is what we call. And so that leads us to a definition of self-affirmations. They refer to thoughts or behaviors. We use writing exercises, but I say thoughts and behaviors because we're moving to apps that bolster one's sense of self as competent, effective, and able to control important outcomes. And again, I just want to remind you that it's not self-esteem. And I want to show you what our exercises look like. And I'm going to skip over this. And so what we do is we try to introduce these self-affirmation exercises during moments of stress in classrooms to see if we can reduce this psychological threat and boost performance uniquely for underrepresented students. So these are structured writing exercises. They're very short, 15-minute writing exercises. They're integrated into the middle school classroom. This was also done in a different school district in 7th grade. They're developed in conjunction with teachers and administrators at the school site, and I'll show you what they look like. We use controlled and scripted procedures. We do this because we don't want the teachers to introduce any noise into our experimental design, but other ones have actually done them online. They're administered at periods of high stress, like the beginning of the school year, right before holiday break, and right before the Connecticut Mastery Test exams. But what I'm going to show you is the data from is that this was some results that I'm going to show you after there was only one treatment that was done 6 weeks into the start of the middle school. And these are double-blind randomized field experiments. So this is what our affirmation sheet looks like, where we have students simply fill this out. We randomly assign them to a treatment or a control condition. This is another school that's 50% minority and white. So by random assignment at the individual level in the classroom, you can break the groups out like that. So the values are athletic ability, being good at art, creativity, independence, living in the moment, membership in a social group, music, politics, relationships with friends or family, religious values, or sense of humor. They then turn the page and they write about the values that they circled. These are all in envelopes, and so the teachers collect them, but they're told this is not graded. It's just a way for the teacher to help you get to know you a little bit better. So just as a sample of what the 7th grade wrote, these are 3 different African-American 7th graders. One wrote, "Art is important to me because it makes me feel calm. When I'm very upset, like I'm going to cry, I sit down and start listening to music or start drawing a picture." Another student wrote, "If I didn't have creativity, I'd be bored out of my mind." And another one wrote, "If I didn't have my family, I wouldn't be raised right. And if I didn't have my friends, I would be a boring person. If I didn't have my religion, I wouldn't know what to do. I would be lost." So again, it's not about making students feel good, but tapping into the values that are important to them in moments of stress. And so here what we find on the y-axis, this is a metric that translates from a C to approximately a B+. We gave, in our first go at this, we gave the school 1 treatment 6 weeks into the fall quarter. And what you find is that, again, these are 7th graders. I don't know if you could see this, is that this looks, again, this is exactly like the achievement gap that we see in all of our schools, where the white students are outperforming the African-American students. And this is in 7th grade. This was conducted in social studies. When you use 1 treatment of these affirmation interventions, what you find, which is very consistent and very interesting, is that if you look at the white students, there's no difference. So they're getting these same treatments, but it's having no effect on their performance in their social studies class. These are their end of quarter grades. We just collect their transcripts. This data is also, I just want to mention, it's controlling for prior performance and WAVE, because there's different teachers in different classrooms. For the African American students, one treatment of this affirmation intervention, this 15-minute writing exercise, significantly increases their end of quarter performance and reduces the achievement gap by about 35%. When we look at this, there's other replications have been done, and economists argue that this is about the same effect as reducing class size. We didn't really believe this effect, and so the graph at the top is the original study that I just showed you. We conducted 2 replications in social studies. We've done 2 other replications in math. Since this time, we have consistently gotten this effect in about 8 different schools now. I think I'm going to skip this. I'm going to skip this. But what I do want to also point out to you is that we just published a paper a couple of months ago showing that we were able to replicate this effect with Latino students at 2 middle school sites, one in Boulder, Colorado, and one in Santa Barbara, and that these effects persist from anywhere to 1 year all the way up to 3 years. And we have now conducted a longitudinal data analysis with our original cohort, and what we find is that these affirmation interventions do enough to lift performance that it then predicts whether they're going into high school in a sort of low performing track versus a middle performing track. And so it actually seems to perpetuate over long periods of time. And so what I want to do is just sort of give you some concluding remarks, and then we can this goes into the other thing. Okay, so I just want to give you a few concluding remarks, and then hopefully we can have a little bit of discussion. First of all is that these interventions are not, they need to be done in the context of all kinds of other things. Positive teaching environments, we say like they're not going to teach students who can't read to read. Having said that, there's often an insensitivity to the psychological climate. Even when we think we're doing all kinds of things for students, we're not necessarily thinking about the climate in which students find themselves. And that these kinds of interventions, or this sensitivity to the psychological climate by different identity groups, can have a powerful effect on performance and motivation. And I say that, for example, there's some data showing out in Michigan that the underperformance, the group under stereotype threat, is actually boys. There's also some data that also shows that at some very small liberal arts schools. There's work in the Appalachian region that's really socioeconomic class where the threat is. So you need to sort of understand the context and the identity at issue, and then this attentive to the psychological climate can affect performance. So with that, I will close and I will take questions. Thank you.
I've been wondering whether the very practice of giving A through F letter grades is a sort of fiendishly designed mechanism specifically to induce stereotype threat.
Yes. Okay, so that's a great question. I can't answer the question directly about grades. I have my suspicion. What I can answer is that there is data comparing law schools that grade on a bell curve to law schools that don't. And then they look at the magnitude of the gap between women and men, I think L1s, and they find that for schools that grade on a bell curve, which you can make the translation to grades, can predict the gender gap in law school. And so there's this whole argument that you can actually aggravate stereotype threat in an already stressful environment, because it implicitly applies that there's some people at the bottom and some people at the top, and it sort of reinforces what's going on in the environment. So that would lead me to believe that your argument is probably accurate about grades in general. And I think the struggle is people need to find some metric. So you need some way to standardize performance across schools, but at the same time, it may perhaps have these costs.
You can focus on getting every student to a certain mastery level of every topic, and then you don't need grades.
So just remember, I am not an educator, so I'm going to tread lightly. Should I moderate, or do you want to? I do my thing. Okay, so I'll just sort of sweep this way. Yes.
Most of the studies you talked about refer to integrated settings.
Yes.
I'm curious how this might apply to
Yes.
settings that are not integrated.
That is a
settings.
fascinating question, particularly in New York City, right, where the vast majority of public schools are segregated for a variety of reasons. So the data that we have done just by virtue of happenstance have been in integrated schools. Other researchers have done studies in non-integrated schools and have found the identical effects for two reasons. So first of all, there's two kinds of segregated schools. You can have a school that's segregated by choice and by design, and you can have schools just by neighborhood factors. And those climates are going to differ. And in particular, schools that just are schools in which there's a large percentage of either Dominican or African American students, these interventions seem to have the same kinds of effects. And the argument is that the psychological climate, not only in the school, but what students are going to see in the media and in the environment outside of the school is the same. There is not data. There's a few schools, so for example, in Chicago, where they are Afrocentric, African-American centered schools, particularly where they pull out African-American boys. That's a different kind of segregated school. I think it would be called a targeted school or something of this nature. That data we don't know about. Yes, I'll just go right back.
Do you know if anyone's looked at this issue in the context of teacher achievement as opposed to student achievement?
Okay, so this is like my next big, who will collaborate with me so I can write a big grant about this? No, no. No one has looked at this, but I think it absolutely has to affect teachers, because I mean, what I see, you know, again, I'm not an educator, but when I talk to teachers, they are under extreme levels of stress, regardless of where they're from. And then added onto that, there's this sense that these achievement gaps are their fault. You know, that they have to do so or fix it up in their classrooms. So there's all of this, and then there's just enough stories about a teacher, you know, will do something on, you know, show something about black hair, and then they're disciplined. So there's just enough, I think, to make teachers really anxious around these issues of race and gender and identity. And when you don't say anything, it actually exacerbates stereotype threat. I do know that there's one study with middle school teachers showing that their self-report levels of stereotype threat predict girls' math performance in the class. It was a paper published in Nature that I can point you to. But the bottom line is I definitely, there hasn't been enough work with teachers, and I definitely think that's the next place to go. Yes, in the back.
Teachers.
It would also be helpful for me if you just said like your name and where you're from, so I can locate your intellectual space.
I don't know if this will help you locate my intellectual space, but my name is Eric, and I'm from the Robin Hood Foundation.
Oh, Robin. Yep, that works.
Teachers, districts are trying to talk about high stakes tests. They're doing everything they can to try to move the results.
Yes.
I've seen results of studies like yours reported in the press, and it almost seems too good to be true. The impact compared to the investment is just phenomenal.
Yeah.
So are you aware of teachers or schools or school districts which, even unconnected to researchers, have tried to implement interventions like this, and what the results have been?
That's a great question. There is an outfit at Stanford who, they created this website, and the name is escaping me at the moment. But they created this website where teachers can just go onto the website. They sort of plug in some demographic information about their school, and then they send the students to the website, and they do some of these different interventions as homework assignments. The data thus far, so it's still in its preliminary stages, and the data thus far is looking closer to not a reduction in achievement, but a boost in achievement for all students. So from a social justice perspective, the data look great, but from an achievement gap perspective, that doesn't seem to be having the effects that people think it does. And one of the problems that with that kind of method is that the researchers don't have any understanding of the context of the school. So you might be thinking there's a racial achievement gap, but really it's just an achievement gap with boys or certain groups, and you can't really calibrate the intervention. So on the one hand, that is hopeful that we'll be able to use these interventions in a more, just, you don't need to actually have an experiment, but the data from that project is not showing a reduction in gaps, it's showing a boost in performance for all groups. Oh, last question, oh no. Okay, I will take you, but then the rest of you please come up. Sorry, yes?
James Farmer, New York City Charter School Center. So, does the intervention work if folks, if the subjects know the secret of the intervention?
Yes, this is a great question, $1 million question. It does not. It does not. So we've done studies in the laboratory where you tell people, basically we're fixing you up, this is an intervention, this is going to help you, and it doesn't work. And so this is actually a big problem because teachers get really annoyed. Nobody wants random assignment in their classroom, and they want to tell, they want to know what's going on, and they want to tell their students what's going on. But the data from the laboratory studies suggests that when you tell people, the effect goes away because nobody wants to be fixed up, right? Especially students. And one of the reasons is that then the ambiguity is still there, right? Why do I need to be fixed up? Why are you fixing me up? Who else are you fixing up? So we would argue that telling people keeps that racial ambiguity on the table.
Right, but doesn't that then have implications for scaling?
It actually has. This is what we think about all the time. So we have been trying to work out how you can integrate them into the curriculum, like just as part of lessons or after school. We're trying to start some projects if we can get interest in schools of getting parents to slip it to them like vegetables. But it's a very serious problem, and there isn't research in merely if you teach a lesson to teachers and principals about the principles of these interventions, would it actually affect student performance? And those are the kinds of questions that are called second generation questions. We now know that the studies work, but we want to ask these scaling up questions. And that's actually where my work is going. So anyone who's interested in collaborating in terms of those questions, please let me know so I can get tenure. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I will stay here and answer questions. And I just want to thank you all for your attention, and yeah, thank you so much.